Okie doke. Wow, I have like the best people in the planet with me today. We're going to talk about BIPOC comics. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is a panel on why scholarship on BIPOC comics matters, and it's session 2. I'm Frederick Luis Aldama. Some of you know me as Professor Latinx or Latinx. I teach at The Ohio State University. I've written a bunch of books and especially really excited about Latinx pop culture and comics. My kids' book just came out, The Adventures of Chupacabra Charlie, and I'm happy to say that my sci-fi comic, Labyrinth's Born, is about to go into production. I'm here, though, to be in the great company of these incredibly talented scholars and creators, poets, artists working across all sorts of disciplines to put together this panel, session 2 of BIPOC Comics Matters. And Dr. Jennifer Carrocillo Maldonado recently minted PhD from Rutgers University, currently adjunct professor at Rutgers, author of numerous articles on Latinx nonfiction and fiction comics, and currently at work on her book that will be the first study of Latinx graphic life stories. Dr. Deborah Whaley, professor of American Studies at the University of Iowa, award-winning author of numerous books, including Black Women in Sequence, and Dr. Fernanda Diaz Basteris, visiting assistant professor of Spanish at Cornell College, author of numerous articles on Latinx fiction and nonfiction, and currently working on visual representation of topics such as the undocumented American life experience, social political crisis of disasters, aftermath, and communal digital storytelling of forced displacement. Welcome. So glad you're here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I'm going to jump us in here, kind of maybe in the deep end, but and I'm going to start with Deborah. Deborah, you know, how did you get into researching and publishing in comics?
My entry into comic book study sort of happened, I don't want to say as accident, but it wasn't something that just stemmed from research I was already doing. It really sort of came out of the type of art that I do. So the only training I've had in art, I am an artist, I mostly paint, but the only training I've had in art is in cartooning. So I was always, since I was a kid, just drawing comics and comic figures and copying characters in the newspaper and seeing if I could, you know, perfectly replicate them. And then I ended up doing some training in cartooning. And so it's just something I sort of did on the side. And then in 2004 is when I really got into researching and writing about comics, when the very failed film Catwoman came out. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, being someone who, you know, I was born in 1969, and so I grew up on Batman reruns in the 1970s, and I was really transfixed by the character Catwoman as played by Eartha Kitt. And so when that film came out in 2004, I thought, well, it's really interesting to make a sort of comparative analysis between the 2004 version and what Eartha Kitt was trying to do. And so I just started writing an article, and I just found that there wasn't really a lot written on Black women in sequential art and comic books, graphic novels, or even the characters who would show up in television or film. And so I just started doing more research and started interviewing Black women who are artists and writers. And it just grew from there. But I've always taught various forms of sequential art, comic strips, comic books, etc. In my teaching. So that's how it came about for me.
Wow, yeah, and your work has been so important to all of us. Yeah, Jennifer, tell us about your kind of origin with comics and comic studies.
Yeah, so I didn't read a lot of comics growing up. I was really into the X-Men animated series. That was something that was really influential for me. And I think it was just, you know, what it meant to be a misfit, what it meant to be an outcast, and then also what it meant to do the right thing, you know, when that's not the easy thing. And I read a few comics in high school, but it wasn't until college where I was actually introduced to graphic novels. I had a few classes, professors who actually assigned Alison Bechdow's Fun Home and Jean Yuan Yang's American Born Chinese. And this was like the first time I saw these kind of not adult, but like graphic novels that were like longer narratives and that you can actually study them in school. Like you can actually talk about them in, you know, as scholarship. So I thought that was really great. And so I think in my master's program, when I was really starting to look at and explore more Latinx literature, I noticed there was not a ton of scholarship being done on Latinx comics specifically. You know, obviously you've kind of like broken that open and like led the way for all of us, Profe. And so for me, I finally, when I actually got to my doctorate, I wanted to really look at Latinx comics. And so that was just a way for me to kind of combine those like two parts of my intellectual world. And that's kind of what I've been running with it ever since. People allow me to write about it, publish, talk about it. So I keep going.
So excited about your work in the past now and what you're going to be publishing for us in your book in the future. Fernanda.
Hi, everyone. Well, I grew up. I was born and in Mexico City, and I grew up in the Yucatan Peninsula, and I grew up reading a lot of comics. But in Mexico, we call them monos, like monkeys, and historietas. And most of them are nonfiction. Most of them are about what is happening in the country. And or some of them are fiction, but there's no superpowers involved besides the wrestlers, the luchadores. Still not a superpower. Anyway, I grew up reading Mafalda from Argentina, a lot of feminism and critical thinking in that comic. And I also grew up reading the moneros, the Mexican moneros. Most of them are single panel cartoons that they publish every day at one sort of left newspaper in Mexico called La Jornada. So I have the full collection of Mafalda. And so I grew up reading that, but I never linked it to any sort of BIPOC concept, because in Mexico that is an idea that doesn't exist in Mexican reality, because we are all brown without knowing that we are brown. Because I didn't know I was brown until I moved to the US. So yeah, so I grew up on those comics, but the first encounter that I had with like comic as a tool to spread awareness and knowledge was when I was doing an internship as an undergrad with UNICEF and with the nonprofit local organization. And we created a comic to give away in local communities, in indigenous Mayan communities, about the bilingual education that Mayans have the right to under the Constitution of Mexico. But most of them go to school in Spanish instead of going to school in their own native language. So UNICEF was doing some sort of survey on how the Mayans feel about learning in Spanish. So we created a comic in Maya and in Spanish about their rights. So that was like my first hands-on encounter with comics. But then during my master's at the University of Cincinnati, I attended this conference at Miami University. in Oxford, in Ohio. And I didn't know that I was going to the American Bande Dessinée Society conference. Some colleagues from the French department told us, the Spanish department, that there was this very cool conference at Miami University and we should go. So I went, and I got obsessed. I was shocked, and the keynote speaker was Cena Abirache, which is a lady from Beirut, and she has these 4 graphic novels about her upbringing in the civil war, in the Lebanese civil war in Beirut. And she was the keynote speaker, and she was presenting her work, and it blew my mind. I was like, what? Ladies, brown ladies talking about their lives in comics? So I completely understood at that moment that there was another way to tell your own story, and there was another way for female brown creators to tell their story. And I got all her books, and I was like, I need to study this like deeply. So I like that was what hooked me into comic studies. But then during the PhD, I explore a lot the Caribbean comics circuit, and I decided that I wanted to focus on Puerto Rican comics and colonialism.
I'm so glad that you guys are doing, found your way to comics, BIPOC comics, Latinx comics. But I know that, you know, as women of color scholars, as women of color creators, in a space that has been dominated by men and white men at that you've encountered challenges and overcome challenges. And I'm wondering if you feel comfortable sharing some of those with us, because, you know, it's not easy. It takes a lot of courage, you guys, to be doing the work that you're doing. And maybe, Deborah, we could start with you.
Sure. So I've come up against a few obstacles researching and writing about comics, and a couple things come to mind. One is, you know, I sort of mentioned that the first thing I've written on comics was about Catwoman, the character, and how she changed over time and the different racial, ethnic compositions of the character. So when I began trying to publish that and sending it, you know, to journals, and I didn't send it to a journal that primarily published work on sequential art. I started out submitting it to a sort of cultural history interdisciplinary journal. And so, of course, there's this idea that even though things have changed, comics is sort of a remedial type of literature. It's something that's just for kids. It's not serious, etc. And so in some of the reviewer comments, that's actually what some of the reviewers sort of wrote, like, why should we care about what kids read? Or why should we care about, you know, the fantasies of adults that they create through these narratives for that, you know, that kids read? But what was great is, you know, once I submitted it to a journal that focuses on comics and graphic novels, not only did I get amazing feedback from the reviewers, right, because they're in the field, which really made it a much better, sharp article, and I published it, and that gave me some confidence. And again, I got really great feedback that really helped me take the piece to the next level. The other thing as an artist that I've come up against is, so most recently I did publish a one-panel comic, and I wanted to comment on some of what's going on right now. And so this summer I did a painting of George Floyd right after his public execution that week, just as a way to process it. And I use my art a lot of times in that way, especially when I paint, as a way sometimes as a precursor to what I'm going to write, or as a way to process a variety of things. And so I did this painting of Floyd with an upside down American flag behind him, just to sort of comment on issues of Black citizenship and policing, and to humanize someone who was dehumanized, which allowed for him to be publicly executed. So I thought, okay, well, so I'll take this painting and I will build a narrative around it that takes up the ways in which sometimes folks will sort of decry racism in the public sphere or say they support Black Lives Matter, but in their daily life, sometimes they're not always making those connections in ways that are important to bring about change. And so when I, submitted it at first, I got a lot of great feedback, but part of the feedback I got, and this is interesting because it was sort of opposite when I was trying to publish, the art department said, well, we'd like it to be even more sort of caricatured and even more so like in a comic form. So I was taking something that maybe was a little too serious in terms of at least its visual representation and thinking about, okay, well, how can I build in a little bit more comedy, a little bit more satire? I mean, comedy, how do you, build in humor to something so serious? But and at first I was like, I don't really want to change the visuality of this. But then again, once I got this great feedback from the art department and I started playing around with it, it ended up being a much better comic in a real comic graphic novel form than it ever was when I was trying to use the painting. And so, that's just a couple of examples of some of the things that both artists and, people researching and writing about comics come up against. And I've heard this from other, women of color artists or those who are building the narratives. There's, people being concerned about the subject matter or the way they approach visuality. Or just thinking that there's no place for Black women or women of color at all as writers, as illustrators, as inkers, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. That gatekeeping, and gosh, but you guys are, amazing because you basically keep pushing. And I have a 14-year-old, and you guys are really kind of helping clear those pathways for her. So thank you. Fernando, how about you?
Well, I am openly Mexican. So that has been my first challenge, of course, living in the US. I am not a US citizen, and I have always been in the US under different visas depending on what I'm doing. And that has been a very big challenge, not just in legal level, but also in a cultural level as well, because I do have political opinions, but I don't have any right to practice my preferences. And some of the challenges I have overcome is, first of all, deciding who I am and taking a space in where I work, where I study, where I teach, where I exist, and being consistent with that and being coherent with who I am, where I come from, what do I stand for, where I'm going. And that's been a personal journal, but has also been an academic journey. And there has been people along this path that have been very helpful and have acted like mentors. And there have been people that are afraid of the difference and are afraid of the representation of real diversity and are afraid of real inclusion. And that has been a very big challenge in the workplace. When I look around in the faculty meetings and I am the only non-citizen and the only person that is not a white American fellow. So then I get to the classroom and those challenges are also there, because it's also hard for students to decolonize their learning process and stop judging who is in front of them depending on their race and color and even language and even accent. So female professors and Black BIPOC female professors, I think we all face a very strong filter when it comes to acceptance in the classroom, depending on our race and our gender. And that's a big challenge, and I recognize it. I have learned from it. I have grew in it, and I feel very good when students are able to also go through those filters and learn from me and from my different voice, from my different perspective, and that the students actually practice inclusion and they reflect on what it is to be in an immediate contact with the difference.
Yeah, so powerful, so important, so needed. I'm so glad that you talked about your classroom experience there, Fernanda. Jennifer.
I think for me, it was really an issue for a long time, just not seeing myself or other, particularly characters of color in comics, you know, kind of addressing that silence, that invisibility. And so I feel like it's been like this redemptive work in my scholarship and the scholars that I'm in conversation with, of really trying to focus on specifically Black and Indigenous comics, graphic novels. And for me personally, it's always, you know, whether it's in the classroom or at conferences or things like that, this assumption that either I don't belong or I don't know enough. So anytime someone finds out particularly that I study comics, it becomes this kind of third degree 20 questions of like, all right, well, let's talk about, you know, Batman number 15 or, you know, Marvel or, you know, kind of start quizzing me. And it's like, whoa, first of all, let's step back. But I feel like then, you know, kind of puts me in this like defensive position where it's not fun to be in. And then also constantly having to like justify what I'm studying, whether it's Latinx literature, you know, why should we care about that? Or why is it comics? Why should we care about that? And then when we have like Latinx and Black comics, why, you know, in both of those like realms, why should we care? I've had to answer that question more times than I should. So I think for me is like finally developing, you know, that thick skin, finally developing that confidence to really, you know, not have to, you know, ask for space, not have to apologize for being in those spaces, whether it's in front of the classroom. I've had, you know, students who said, well, women don't read comics or girls aren't into comics. And I'm just like, I'm standing here teaching you all about comics and there's other women students here who are really into them. Like, so, you know, kind of having to, you know, address those very, those challenges, as Fernanda was saying, with difference. And so for me, it's been also like recuperative, really focusing on those narratives, focusing on those issues within those graphic texts, because I like the fact that we can kind of shift the focus, you know, as opposed to, you know, what are we missing in, you know, Marvel or DC cinematic universe, you know, but like shifting it to let's focus on those narratives, let's focus on things that are kind of centering people of color within, you know, graphic narratives, and, you know, doing that through the work that we do. So not having to apologize, not having to, you know, justify claiming that space. And so particularly, you know, in not only what we're writing, but who we're citing. And so for me, you know, just finding a community of other women of color comics writers and scholars, you know, reading more of their work, you know, exchanging ideas and venting and things like that online and, you know, at conferences. And so really, you know, establishing that community has helped address those challenges and, you know, deal with them.
Yeah. Oh gosh. So this kind of beautifully leads to, you know, our next question about, you know, why the study, why the teaching, why the focus on BIPOC comics is important, why it matters. And it's interesting, Jennifer, that you mentioned community. You know, there's this part of it that sometimes we don't really kind of, you know, wake up to, but, you know, in lots of ways, it's actually a way for us to create sort of solidarity and community as scholars and creators of color. But I wanted to, Jennifer, while I have you, and then we can kind of work through our other incredible panelists here, ask you why BIPOC, I don't know, like that kid in the classroom who's just like, oh, and, or, that moment when you're kind of asked and you said, look, I'm not asking permission, I'm just doing it. There is a kind of strong sense of a mission. And what is that mission, I guess?
For me, what I've noticed in my scholarship is particularly because I really focus on graphic memoirs and comic biographies. And I am really interested, and I think it's really important to find those narratives that kind of focus on, people who are doing kind of everyday things. Because I feel like on the flip side, especially with superheroes, when it comes historically, I think, to particularly Black characters, I never want to kind of get into that realm of deifying or making superhuman, because then we kind of fall back on those old tropes of, when we make particularly like Black characters or historical people superhuman, we're also taking from their humanity and kind of buying into those tropes. And what I've noticed too is, particularly people of color in graphic novels, graphic memoirs, aren't allowed to just kind of be. They can't be mundane. And not in the way where we can have like 50 graphic memoirs of, Robert Crumb or whatever white guy kind of just brushing his teeth, hanging out for 50 pages, and that'll get published. But God forbid we actually get someone who, isn't a white cis hetero dude doing just something regular. That has to be like this fight to get published by, the major publishing companies, or if we can have a smaller independent press do that, or go the route of self-publishing or online, just that in terms of access, really, I think addressing that. So for me, really wanting to hope, I want to see, particularly in the graphic memoir genre, just more stories, more people writing and drawing and creating and focusing on that are just kind of doing everyday things. And that's okay too, because there's also in the kind of everyday complicated what it means to be human, what it means to have a messy life. I think that's also really helpful to read about, because for me, and I know other people who are very much into particularly comic biographies and graphic memoirs, it's important to kind of see yourself, in those pages, seeing people deal with also, the complicated, the hardships and issues, but also the everyday things, having a balance between that. So for me, I think those stories really matter, and putting those stories front and center.
Absolutely. And of course, we all know that scholarship equals cultural capital. And if, so in that sense, yeah, you're allowing for and amplifying within the space of the ivory tower the significance of Latinx, graphic nonfiction memoir. Absolutely. Deborah.
Sure. So for me, the really great thing about sequential art, comic books, graphic novels, and other forms of visuality in sequence, sometimes with narratives, sometimes not, is the ways in which it attracts people because of the visual, because of the pithy narrative, because of the ability for those who, for example, are doing comic strips or adding satire and humor into their work to talk about serious issues, historical moments of great significance, to talk about the multifaceted aspects of identity through this form, and perhaps in a way that can reach an audience because of the visuality of it, because of the ways in which many writers of comics are able to use humor to take some of the bite away, maybe from a really serious issue, but still get their point across. And so, because there are not enough representations and narratives of historically marginalized groups in this form, anytime you have someone who is writing narratives or presenting historically marginalized groups visually in ways that are different from the dominant type of characterization, especially for people of African descent and other and people of color, Asian American, Latinx, American Indian, and Indigenous, we have been caricaturized visually, right? Sort of drawn as animals, or sort of hyper focus on certain features to make people of color look scary and threatening and all of this. And so, we have artists who have been able to draw and ink our humanity in ways that doesn't hyper caricaturize us. And so I think that's really important. And I really like the idea of not just focusing on the narrative and the ways in which historically marginalized groups are able to present these sort of counter narratives of their identities, of their histories, et cetera, but also really thinking about the visuality too, that people drawing comics are bringing to the conversation and to the field, and not just in terms of them not sort of hyper characterizing and debasing the visuality of us, but also to take a moment to celebrate the beautiful art that they are creating, right? So as much as, we're still kind of making our way through and finding our place in the field of comics, I think, just people of color, historically marginalized groups, largely in art, there's still a struggle there to get their art seen as equal to be able to disseminate it in the public sphere, to be able to have it show up in museums. And so there's still that struggle there, right? And so, for me, it is absolutely important to have historically marginalized groups writing these narratives, drawing, inking, being editors, being producers, providing publishing outlets. So before we were talking about gatekeeping. And so I think there's a variety of segments within the field that people of color can locate and fill to broaden out the scope and the opportunities for us all.
Gosh, I love the phrase "ink our humanity." Thank you, Deborah. Really kind of a wonderful way to kind of anchor this conversation. Fernanda, how about you? This almost mission, yeah.
Well, first of all, I think that learning this scholarship, doing this scholarship matters, because we have so much work to do on learning the master narratives that we have learned since the very first day that we walked into school. And I think finally we got to that point in the human history that we are going to unlearn all the past. And teaching BIPOC comics matters because it is a practice of diversity, it is a practice of equity, it is a practice of justice, and especially, and more importantly for me, it's a practice of collaboration. And academia is not very good at working in teams. And it is a real struggle when we actually try to practice collaboration and community. And I think a lot of these narratives represent collaboration within BIPOC subjects. And also, I think any research that is initiated by diverse populations benefit everyone. And it is not the same when research is initiated by white fellows. It doesn't benefit everyone. So if we want our minority, because I still don't believe that we are minority, students to empower themselves and to feel like they deserve the space that we put them in academia. I think that they need, and it is the fair thing to do, these materials inside the classroom, and these materials to take space in libraries, in bookshelves, in the syllabus. And if I can't see myself in the things I read, if I can't find my life experience in the movies I watch, in the shows I watch, in the music I listen to, if I can't find myself, how do I preserve my own cultural existence? So I think it's crucial to bring these materials and pedagogical tools into the classroom at a college level, because they have always been part of our life. They have been ignored and marginalized, but they are part of who we are, and they are fundamental in all the aspects of our human development. So that's why I think they matter.
Yeah, wow. So really a kind of the study and the teaching, the commitment to BIPOC comics as enacting a kind of countermeasure to histories of culture side. We forget that demographics are not, folks aren't just literally erased, through mass murder, but through the kind of this slow erosion that we call culture side. So important. You all talked a little bit or touched on aesthetics, genre, nonfiction, fiction, the kind that use humor to convey or to bring us into serious issues. Is there, this is a tricky question and maybe something that's not exactly answerable, but are there genres that you see us gravitating toward in BIPOC comics? And do these do different work to one another? Or, yeah, does that make sense? Maybe, Deborah, do you want to take us forward on this one? Can't hear you.
I've been really encouraged by the ways in which authors and artists have played with various genres that have certain conventions and then expanded those genres and rethought them in ways that can speak to the Black experience of people of African descent, Indigenous people, Latinx, Asian American, Middle Eastern as well. And so I'm really excited by the ways in which, for example, horror comics and Gothic comics are able to use these sort of standard genre fields and think about the ways in which these genres can change or shift or be used, not only to insert us into these genres where oftentimes, like, for example, horror, right? If you're Black in a horror film, usually you die first. So there's just certain ways in which people of color show up in these genres. And same thing for comedy, right? You're the minstrel, you're the fool, you're there to make people laugh. And so I've been really struck by the ways in which artists and writers can take the comedic form and insert signifying and Black cultural and folk idioms, the ways in which they can take Gothic and horror comics and, play with some of those conventions of the genre in terms of people being alienated from society and thinking about some of the aspects of the genre that can be applicable through the experiences of people of African descent. Same thing with, sci-fi. So, I'm thinking of like, for example, the work of Octavia Butler, right, that sort of straddles science fiction and horror, and then the ways of, for example, comic artists like John Jennings has been able to take the work of Octavia Butler, rethink it through the graphic form, and keep some of the great things about her work in terms of the hybridity of identity, thinking about how we think about time and use time differently. It could be cyclical, it could be going back and forth, but it's not necessarily linear. And so I think that, and then I'm also thinking of some of his sort of noir comics and the ways in which he's able to sort of rethink Black masculinity through a sort of noir gothic form. And so I think sometimes folks who study popular culture, whether it's just sort of teaching about it or writing about it, when we talk about genres, sometimes, you know, we sort of critique the limitations of a genre, that it's sort of cookie cutter, that it's just giving you these conventions that aren't necessarily artistic or thinking outside of the box. And I think there are a lot of artists and writers, not just people of color, but people in general, who've been able to, you know, take these genres and do different things. I'm thinking of the work in anime and manga, so Afro manga and Afro anime, and the ways in which writers and artists have taken Japanese comics and animation and using some of those cultural aspects and visual aspects, but rethinking it in a way that speaks to Black consciousness, Black history, Black narratives, and so almost sort of creating like a hybrid genre. I've written about Afro-gothic comics in the same sort of a way, taking that convention, re-articulating it, rethinking it, making it anew, expanding that genre boundary to tell stories that matter to us and that have significance, as Fernanda was saying, to all people, when you're able to create these sort of counter narratives.
Jennifer, you work, you're very focused on nonfiction forms. So tell us how you would answer this question.
Yeah, I think for me, with the question of genre is really interesting, and for me, I just find the different genres powerful in their own way. So particularly, even kind of stepping away from nonfiction, looking at like superhero comics, I think the reason that they're so potent is because they're these modern myths. They instill in us these belief systems, how we tell right from wrong, and I think that's really important. And it's really important then to include a broad swath of different experiences and identities. And with nonfiction, it's so important to help us kind of deal with the everyday broader issues of society, and seeing that how others have dealt with it, both in an individual form, and how that can kind of then tell a story of larger collectives. And that's kind of where my work mostly focuses on, looking at these kind of individual nonfiction graphic narratives, and how the visuals also help tell those stories of a larger community. And then also to science fiction and fantasy, I think has just been so amazing for us to reimagine our futures, but then also reimagine our past. And so I love Deborah, mentioning Octavia Butler, and then, being kind of reincarnated in the graphic novel form, is because it gives us this way absolutely to play with time, and it just makes absolute sense, particularly with Butler's narratives, because it's this kind of rejection of linear time, and we see that absolutely with the form of the comic page, how you read it. It's not just necessarily kind of going from left to right. You kind of can go back and forth. You can really up to the reader's eyes where they want to look at it, but you're also getting everything at the same time, but then honing in kind of honing in on like one little part, and then zooming out, zooming in. So I think it's been really great, these, the different genres, but then particularly the comic form, how it kind of allows us, for our consciousness, the way that we record history, the way that we talk about events, it allows us for a more nuanced and complicated way of doing that. And that's what I've always really found aesthetically, about the comic page, about art, in relationship to images and words, I think just the wanting to tell a story is so universal. But then, Fernanda, like you were saying, we have to make sure also when we're using those narrative tools that they're actually, we're not closing in and we're not, just telling one particular story that only speaks to a few. So for me, just the plethora of genres within comics, graphic novels is just, it's there and it's amazing. And I love that we have access to it and hopefully more.
Fernanda, how would you answer this?
Well, I think there are many ways to experience comics and the form. And in countries like mine, in countries like Mexico, we experience this genre as part of the daily life because there is access to them in the street in a very, very cheap, like in a very cheap value, like in the sense of you pay a little bit of money to acquire a comic book or little kind of like flyer or single issue thing, and you do not need to be well versed, or you don't need to be well educated to experience a comic and this democratization of the humor, the fun, the political opinion, the social critique, and I think that is very different to how we experience comics inside the US. Inside the US, there are these massive companies, and there are also these big independent companies, because when we also see at independent comics, there are many levels of being an independent comic. And anyway, I think the experience of the genre is super different in countries like the one that, like Latin American countries, Spanish-speaking countries, Africa, Europe, Asia. So I think depending on the culture, the genre has different uses, and it can be exclusive or inclusive depending on the market as well. For example, in Mexico, there was this comic that was called Libro Vaquero, and it was like almost a pornographic kind of comic with the narrative about different sexual encounters between different men and women that were part of the working class society in Mexico. And it was bought mainly by workers of the construction and people that were just in a bus stop waiting for their daily commute or in the subway station. So that genre fit for that purpose, So I feel like autobiographical graphic narratives that are inside a classroom and in a syllabus, it does exclude who can afford a $15 book, who has internet to order it from Amazon, or any other independent bookseller, who actually has a car to drive to a bookstore, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like it depends on which society are we looking at a genre that we can actually judge what is the use of it.
Yeah, thanks for reminding us of that very important kind of the politics, the regionalism, the kind of different, ways that we have access to comics. So important. Just out of respect for the gift that you three have given us of time and expertise, let me end by asking maybe two linked questions. One, was there a sort of surprising moment in your teaching of comics, a kind of like, wow, I never knew this could happen? And related to that, is there a comic that you would always want to have on your syllabus, like a BIPOC comic? You want to, in other words, the one that like just it's the gift that keeps on giving, and you go back to, it's the one that's on your desk, never moves, unless you're reading it and studying it again and again. So Jennifer, let's start with you.
I don't know if I can pick just one. There's just so many. So I think I'm going to sidestep that a little bit. But kind of the earlier question, I guess, for me, actually, sorry, really quickly remind me what was the first part of that question.
Sorry, I know. A two-parter, it's tough.
Yeah.
Was there like a surprising moment, where like you're like, oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, just learning more historically about what is out there, particularly in either superhero comics or in nonfiction like memoirs, and learning about the history in terms of, how that form has been used not only to kind of as satire or as comedy or as, kind of the fantastical, but then also particularly how it's kind of been embedded and, kind of used different parts in society. So thinking just about inequality or thinking about representation, stuff like that. So for me, it's been really amazing kind of to learn more that like these have existed, outside what we see in like the mainstream entertainment. And then particularly, I think definitely questions of access, but really for me, thinking about how we can connect those. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I think for me, really, it's the historical nature of different comics and graphic novels that's always been really fascinating and keeps bringing me back time and again.
Mm-hmm. Deborah.
Sure. So just to sort of follow up on Jennifer's point about thinking about the ways in which sequential art can sort of think about history and historicize certain aspects. For me as an educator, as someone who brings in comics into the classroom, I have found it really useful to fill in knowledge gaps in history, right? So especially when I'm teaching first and second year students, just ever since I've been teaching, I continue to hear things like, we never heard of Japanese internment. We never learned about Asian and Asian American history in primary and secondary ed. So bringing in a compilation like Secret Identities that uses the graphic form to talk about the variety of Asian ethnic cultural experiences and different historical experiences is quite useful. Obviously, I teach it alongside other articles and monographs and documentaries that can be very powerful as well. But oftentimes I think about, well, what if at the primary and secondary level, graphic novels, comic books were brought in, like the compilation Secret Identities, or like the comic book Peace Party that talks about indigenous and native identities. Oftentimes I hear students say that, well, we knew about the civil rights movement, but we didn't know there was a Chicano civil rights movement. We didn't know there was an American Indian movement. And I've been really struck by and pleased by artists and writers who are using this form to talk about those really important moments in history and activist practices through this form. And it does two things. Again, there's the narrative and sort of filling in that gap, but there's also the visuality and being able to represent visually different demographics in ways that they oftentimes don't show up. So one of the things you were asking as well as part of this question, I think, was what was sort of like a aha moment or an aha moment or sort of a defining moment. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about the art of Kara Walker. So a lot of times people think about her work as, working within the realm of fine art. And I think that's true and, a true characterization, but at the same time, she's really doing comics and sequential art, right? So there, so Kara Walker, as you all know, but some of us, some folks who may watch this later may not know, uses caricatures and really kind of stereotypical and debased ways in which people of African descent have been represented, but she presents it in this sort of silhouette form. And it's almost like when you're looking at her images, especially, you know, in a museum where you're sort of being brought through this narrative, because she has these Black silhouette forms that tell stories about slavery, about the ways in which the scripts of slavery are still playing out in modern times. And so, you know, she's gotten a lot of flack for presenting visually some of the stereotypes or debased images that a lot of artists have been trying to, you know, debunk and not recapitulate in their own work. But ironically, it is precisely her use of those stereotypes that allows the spectator to sort of think about perhaps the kind of scripts that they may have about deformed ideas of Blackness, and, you know, oftentimes, you know, not necessarily like seeing people of African descent in humanized ways. And because she's working in the form of silhouette, she's able to say, well, how do you know these characters are Black? How do you know what characters are Black? How do you know what characters are white? Are you bringing into the process your own sort of scripts of race? And then let's look at that. Let's look at what that means. So this caricature that you think is sort of like the pickaninny stereotype, again, it's in silhouette. What do you know? What have you learned that allows you to see the character in this way? And so that's just another example of sequential art. And so, you know, I teach Kara Walker's work, and I remember one session in particular where I put an image on the screen, and, you know, some of the students were really horrified, and one person said, this is disgusting, this is horrible, you know, why is she being given all this money to do this work? And then it was a really wonderful moment to sit down and sort of think about it. I think you can talk about Aaron Magruder's work in the same way. You know, people say, well, gosh, you know, he is really digging deep into these really dangerous images of people of African descent. But then we can sort of talk about, okay, well, what cultural work does this type of way of talking about Blackness and visualizing it do when you sort of pair it with a re-articulated narrative and you think about issues of spectatorship, et cetera. But it's a great question. I could say a lot more, but I'm really excited to hear what, you know, Fernanda has to say as well.
Fernanda, let's hear it.
Yeah. I had two very intense moments while teaching my Latinx graphic narrative course. One was analyzing in a very close reading Speed and Passion from Christy Road, by Christy Road. Especially because I finally understood why my brother was so obsessed with Green Day when we were growing up in Mexico. And my brother was obsessed. And for me, it was an okay album, music, genre, whatever, but he was really obsessed. And going through the graphic novel with my students, I was like, okay, brother, now I hear you 20 years later. That was one thing. And then the other thing was that for the first time, I had this student in this class, and also for the first time, Cornell College has this student on campus, that it's a refugee. It's an asylum seeker, and officially, and he's open about it. And we were reading all these web comics and digital comics from in the NIB, the website, about crossing borders and asylum seekers and all these separated families at the ICE centers. And we were reading them, and it was like being in like a third dimension. Like we were reading them, we were listening to him, and he was reading them, and we were all writing about it. And then this student shared with us that an NGO and a nonprofit took his case back in another state and created a comic about his migration process as a very young kid crossing the border with other young kids from Central America. And he has a comic about his own journey. And I just felt that it was too meta. It was a perfect moment to understand and to give the form a lot of value on how to tell stories that are nonfiction, that are grounded on community knowledge, and that are grounded on community struggle, and especially on survivors' experience.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So just how can we find you, our viewers or listeners? Jennifer, what's the best way for folks if they want to learn more about your work and you?
Either on Twitter at jcarosio, or my website, jennifercarosio.net. And yeah, that's, I think those would be the two best ways to get in contact with me.
Brilliant. Fernanda?
You can search me on academia, or you can also search on Instagram, Latinx graphic narratives. And yeah, I think those two are the best options.
Perfect. And Deborah?
I am all over the web. You can look at some of my scholarship and look at some interviews and different things that I've done over time at my website, DeborahElizabethWhaley.com. I also have a Tumblr that's linked from my website, where I archive multi-ethnic representations in comics and sequential art, and mixed into that is a lot about alternative rock and music cultures too, but comics is primarily what's in my Tumblr. You can find me on Twitter at DEWHALEY. And I'm also on, like I said, I'm all over the internet and social media. Also on Instagram as well. And I always tell folks, please feel free to email me, as well, if you want to sort of continue these conversations about characters and titles and the cultural and artistic work of the sequential art form.
Well, I want to thank you, all three of you, Jennifer, Fernanda, Deborah, for gifting us your time, your expertise. Really, this has been an incredible learning experience for me and will be for others. BIPOC scholars, creators, why they matter, but also why they matter in practice and as a kind of space for us to create community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure.
Awesome.